example, another type of experiment. So we just are doing experiments in the lab now which go this way, where we present a whole series of pictures, 10 pictures per second, bam, 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 like this, very, very quickly. So you cannot be aware of all of them. What we see is that the visual areas of the brain code for every one of them. And in fact, this is an interesting new development also in brain imaging. We can use the brain activation to decode what is the image that was being presented. So it's a quite fascinating development, I think, that we begin to be able to look at the brain and we can decode what was seen by the person and even what was not seen by the person. That is, I think it's interesting that we have objective aspects to the brain, objective access. We can, even better than the subject himself, see what was in his mind, right? What was in his unconscious mind.
I see.
But coming to your question, so if we ask the subject to report one particular image, we see that this image is being amplified. And essentially it goes beyond the first 200 milliseconds. What we see is that the first 200 milliseconds of processing are largely unconscious, and they go for all images, one after the other, very quickly. But after 200 milliseconds, only the events that are selected for conscious access, because we ask you to attend to them, make it into the second stage. And so the claim is also that consciousness is late. It's not super late, 1/5 of a second, but it still is behind the online processing. And I think this is a characteristic feature of consciousness. Consciousness allows you to detach from the external world. You don't have to be online. Sensory systems have to be online. They really react to the current stimulus. But the consciousness is a way to back up and say, well, I want to think more about this. I need a system that allows me to hold on to specific information, keep it in mind. So it's very close to what we call also working memory. And we keep the information in mind in a way which is no longer directly related to what is outside in the world. And eventually these systems become so powerful, in humans in particular. I think it exists in other animals, this conscious workspace. But in humans it becomes so developed that you can do mathematics in your mind for hours without any connection to the external world. This is purely conscious reasoning.
So it would be an adaptive way of thinking backwards of what just happened. So re-evaluating and maybe programming the next step.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think this shows, by the way, that consciousness evolved because it is useful to the organism. Some people say, well, consciousness is an epiphenomenon. I don't think that's true at all. I think there is an architecture of consciousness in the brain because it is useful. It's a useful thing to have. We cannot process everything at once. We have to select, and we need this system to back up and be able to think for a long time about specific aspects of the world. So that's the function, I think, of consciousness.
Yeah.
And it also means that perhaps one day we will have that in machines, because this is a useful function to have in a machine. Select information and be able to dispatch it.
So you think like artificial intelligence is going to happen like in the way, the consciousness way?
That's an interesting speculation. If you look at the current developments in artificial intelligence, most of what is being done concerns unconscious processing. For instance, the systems have become excellent at object recognition. How you recognize a face or an object,
voice.
It corresponds very well to what the brain does in the first 1/5 of a second, the first 200 milliseconds. But beyond that, artificial intelligence is not very good. And this begins to correspond almost exactly with what we do consciously. Selecting information, thinking hard about it, going back to the information. So, of course, there are developments as well there, and they are beginning to have more flexible systems that begin to look like consciousness. But I think this is where the most interesting development will be.
So in your theory, there is a parallel processing machines which are very good for that, but then there is a need of a serial processing in order to
and symbolic
re-evaluate
processing.
and symbolic processing.
So I guess this is another thread of thinking which is not fully developed, but and we are coming closer to what is perhaps specifically human. The human brain has a rather specific way of using symbols. We don't need to carry all the weight of the complex representations, we simplify them by giving them a label. So we say elephant, and this completely arbitrary symbol, elephant, becomes a token, very light token, that we can manipulate instead of the very big object with all of its properties of visual, auditory, and so on properties. So I think that we have to search in the human brain for a special architecture that compresses the information in the forms of symbols. And this is something now I'm speaking really about work which is not even published, but it's really in the back of my mind, that we're trying to see the brain as a machine that compresses the information to allow you to really distill the most abstract notion of an idea and compresses it in the form of symbols.
A machine of synthesizing information into a small token, which is maybe visual, auditory, tactile, and then it has to be referred in a language manner? Or?
Well, the question of language is one of the hardest, I think, precisely because it cannot be studied in animals. That we have to study it at the brain level. So we are making very slow progress, I think, in the question of language. My take on this is that we should consider that there are in fact multiple languages in the mind, in the human mind, and that they need not be reflected in specific words. There is really an internal language for manipulating information. So what I would call language is a system for combining representations, combining symbols together, and in order to represent the information centrally before communication. We have to make a distinction between language and communication. I think there is an inner language whose primary goal and primary function in evolution is to represent the external world and to represent it better by combining tokens. And then in a second step, we can communicate these representations, and language as a communication system evolved because we had this interesting mental representation to share with others.
So it would be the ability of putting together information in a sequence that represents something, like a small story, maybe?
Yes, or even a sort of tree structures that organizes the information. But yes, a story is a very good example. If you are able to think back upon a story, you see it as having a beginning, middle, and end. Each of these is decomposed into subparts. We make sense of the world by using such representations. It's not so clear whether other animals can do this. This is an intense area of research at the moment. I belong to the group of people who believe there is a sharp distinction. Something new appeared in the human brain that allowed us to create quite different types of representations. And perhaps representations with a certain form of universality, a little bit like we speak of a universal Turing machine, which is able to do any computation. I wonder whether there is a sort of universal representation machine in the brain, which, if you look at science, allows us to understand virtually any aspect of the external world. Humans seem to have this capacity for learning about essentially any aspect of the external world and representing properly the information, even including information about things we never evolved for, like quantum mechanics or astrophysics. And so in my new book, I speak a lot about this specific capacity of the human brain to learn information. And I think we probably have evolved quite particular representations and capacities in general to acquire more information from the external world. Learning is much more efficient in our species than it is in any other species, I think, on Earth. We have a curiosity which allows us to attend to new information. And then we have internal language systems that allow us to represent the information better. And this means, I think, that the niche of humans has become quite different. Normally, animals have a niche, right? A geographical niche, a particular way of living. Humans are free from that in a certain sense. We have left Africa and our niche can be,
Whatever,
Iceland, can be the moon perhaps someday. People are living in outer space now for months at a time. Our only niche, I think, is the learning niche. We are the learning species. We are the species who is able to acquire new information, and that allows us to invade any part of the world and to exploit it, even to the point of overexploitation this day, because we really are able to grasp and put together the information in science. According to this view, science is a sort of characteristic mode of processing of the human brain. And there is in fact quite interesting research showing that even babies are a little bit like scientists. Yeah. They do a sort of minimal science.
They test.
They experiment.
Information. Yeah.
I know you are an important consultant to the Ministry of Education of France in trying to apply this knowledge of mathematics and language to grammar school. There are 25 million children in Mexico in grammar school. So this idea of the speed of transmission of information from your and other laboratories to the classroom, how is that going? What advice would you give to ministers of education in other places about how to go about making education an experimental science?
It's an interesting challenge. So, as you mentioned, less than a year ago, I was asked to be the president of a scientific council for education that thinks about these issues. The thinking is that we have a lot of knowledge that may already be applied at least to primary school, to basic issues such as learning to read or learning to calculate, maybe learning of geometry. But also, I think we begin to have enough general principles of learning that may be applied to any student. So we're thinking about these issues and helping the system organize better principles for learning to read, for instance. What advice can I give? Well, there are some important discoveries about the way memory works. For instance, it's been known in psychology. By the way, this is mostly about psychology, not so much about neuroscience, but psychology speaking to education. But we know, for instance, that rehearsal is extremely important, and distributing the learning across several days is important. So this is the first piece of advice. Distribute the learning, include rehearsal every day, and tell that to the parents, because it's not just the school, but it's also the parents in the other days of the week.
What about the timing? Every day, for example?
Yes. Well, an important finding has been that there is consolidation during the night. Personally, I think this is a very important discovery from neuroscience, that neurons repeat during the night what happened during the day before, or the preceding few days. And what is remarkable is that this rehearsal is completely unconscious most of the time. Maybe sometimes it leads to dreams, but it's also largely unconscious. And it's faster than life. Something that took you several tenths of seconds to experience during the day may take as little as a few hundreds of milliseconds, less than 1 second, to replay during the night. So the neurons fire extremely quickly during the night. So use that for learning. This is part of the learning process. We think we're sleeping, we think the brain is not active. It's super active, and it is an important component of the learning process. So schools and parents can use that, and the individual learner, by rehearsing just before going to sleep, for instance, you maximize the chances of this replay consolidating the learning during the night. There are many other aspects that I describe in my new book on learning. So one of them is attention. You want to maximize the attention of the child. Maximizing attention is the only way to maximize the learning, actually. So this is simple advice that I think we can give to teachers. I strongly believe that teachers must have a stronger training in some aspects of cognitive science that are pertinent for their domain. And the last thing that I want to say about this aspect of education is that we are far from knowing everything. It's a bridge. It's one more bridge from what we know about the brain to cognitive science, from cognitive science to education. So what we need to do is we need to experiment. We cannot just say we know how it works, we know how schools should be organized, but one important idea I think that scientists have to bring to education is let's do experimentation together. Let's see what works. Let's check simply also whether what you are doing right now is really the best way, is what works the best. So we're going to help you measure how kids are doing. I think cognitive science has very good tools. For instance, in the case of learning to read, we already know how to measure progress in learning to read. And we are going to do experiments together to see whether this way of teaching is better than this way of teaching. And we are going to select progressively the best methods. I think this is a very important contribution that cognitive science could be making to education. It's a little bit the same relation. Education should lean on cognitive science in very much the same way that medicine is leaning on biology as a foundation. I think eventually we'll have the same sort of relationship between these disciplines.
Education should be based on cognitive psychology.
Education is an extension of cognitive psychology. It's making use of this incredible talent of the human brain for plasticity and for learning. Going to the arts, I think these are wonderful challenges. I think our brain science is not very advanced at the moment. So it would be wonderful, for instance, to understand why a poetic sentence or one of Nabokov's wonderful phrases strikes us as beautiful. Or even in the domain of mathematics, why is there beauty in a mathematical theorem? It sounds like one of these emotions that, appeals to us because the mental construction is going to be useful. So I like the idea that there is also an integration of emotion and cognition there, but the truth is that we don't know very much at the level of the brain about what's going on for such high levels of artistic.
What do you think of this relationship between music, language, and mathematics?
We don't know. I don't think we know. We are not sure even if there is such a relation. So it's true that mathematicians often like music or practice music. In the converse direction, it's not so much the case whether musicians are mathematicians. I know some cases of people who are really not at all mathematically oriented. So it's an open question at the moment.
Well, is there a possibility that musical training of children or maybe dancing or some artistic type of activity might have an impact a few years later on the circuits you so elegantly study about language and mathematics?
It's quite possible. It's discussed at the moment. So there seems to be a little bit of overlap between the circuits for music and the circuits for language. And music is, of course, a sort of language, but a language with quite different grammar still than the grammar that we use in normal language. Mathematics is yet another language, and there may again be a little bit of overlap, but not too much. But I'm struck, for instance, that when you learn music, you teach children about the powers of two, for instance. It's crucial to musical notation, right? And you do that in a very concrete manner by explaining the duration of notes goes by powers of two. So children may have experience of mathematics in a more concrete manner and also at an earlier age when they learn music. In general, there are huge benefits to learning music and the practice of a musical instrument in the brain. And so if parents listen to this show, they might be told really that it's extremely important for their children to do music. It's really a huge benefit for the brain. I see the system of writing, for instance, the alphabet, as a special tool, or the system of numbers as a tool. And we begin to see how education to these tools is actually literally changing the brain. I have developed this idea of recycling, which is the view that whenever we acquire capacity in the human brain, such as the capacity for reading, we are in fact reorienting or repurposing circuits of the brain that were present for another purpose in our evolution, but were close enough to the final function that we could redirect them. So we redirect a system that is here to recognize objects and faces, and we repurpose it for the purpose of reading, for instance. So in this way, our species, the human species, has acquired a whole variety of new tools that expand our ability to understand the world.
So in this regard, the areas that are comprised in our brain to represent faces, you mean that we also use it for other things like, for example, writing, reading?
Reading, especially. Yeah. So what we have discovered with several colleagues is that there is a small area of the left hemisphere in the occipitotemporal sulcus which is involved in reading. And in people who don't read, or in illiterate people, this area does something else. It's dedicated to objects and face recognition. But when we learn to read, we specialize this region, and it essentially becomes responsive to strings of letters. And it's this area which allows us to be so quick. When we put our eyes on a written word, we immediately grasp its identity. Well, it's this region which is responsible for that. So when we learn to read, we specialize it for letters, but it means also that the functions of this area are, have to find space elsewhere. And what we have found is this very interesting competition between learning to read and recognition of faces, such that the face system in people who learn to read, the face system has to move more to the right hemisphere because of reading. Language is usually in the left hemisphere in most people, so faces have to move to the other hemisphere.
So these pattern recognition areas, right, like for faces, for instance, once you start using it by learning for reading, it's like there is no more room for adding more items, and then it has to go to the other hemisphere.
We don't fully understand whether it's really there is no more room, because we also know that these areas can differentiate. And the process of education and learning is a process whereby we start with a highly plastic system, which is diverse and will differentiate further in the course of learning. So one thing we see, for instance, which is quite remarkable as well, is that there will be a differentiation further between the symbols of letters and the symbols of numbers. And in patients, for instance, you may have a lesion that leaves the number system intact, but affects only the letter system. So this is an extreme case of specialization. And in general, we're discovering that there's a lot of specialization in the educated brain, and perhaps more than in the uneducated brain.
I see, I see. So this is because of the function it's taken. So
yes, well, these symbols play a very different function. We think it's also because of the connections. So letters connect to the language system, numbers connect to the quantity system in the parietal lobe in particular. And because this is a bilateral system, numbers go in both hemispheres, whereas language is much more left lateralized, so we see this visual word form area system, the reading system emerging in the left hemisphere especially. And in patients, for instance, you may have a lesion that leaves the number system intact, but affects only the letter system. So this is an extreme case of specialization. And in general, we're discovering that there's a lot of specialization in the educated brain, and perhaps more than in the uneducated brain.
I see, I see. So this is because of the function it's taken. So
yes, well, these symbols play a very different function. We think it's also because of the connections. So letters connect to the language system, numbers connect to the quantity system in the parietal lobe in particular. And because this is a bilateral system, numbers go in both hemispheres, whereas language is much more left lateralized, so we see this visual word form area system, the reading system emerging in the left hemisphere especially. In general, we underestimate the level of abstractness of brain circuits. So yes, the dorsal pathway is one that cares a lot about space, certainly, and the positions of objects, but it's also a system that has been called the how system, because it cares about how to shape the motor system to use objects, to grasp them, for instance. But I also think that there is more than that, and in fact I've called it the space, time and number system. Because it's a system essentially for dealing with quantities. And it's not just, by the way, that space, time and number is my first name, Stan. But it's just a joke. But it's true. So this system deals with continuous quantities, including something as abstract as number. And this has been one of my early contributions, and really I really enjoy this work so much. This idea that we all are born with a number system, and in fact very old in evolution. So we have been able to show not only that humans have intuitions of number, like you look at this scene and you know how many objects there are, how many bottles, 4 bottles, you can estimate, But in fact, this is a very old system, so it's already present in infants. Even infants, now this has been shown by a colleague, infants of a few hours of age. They are just born, they already have a system that tells them approximately how many objects are present in the world. So it's innate. And in fact, it's inherited from our evolution, so we can see that monkeys, but many other animal species have this system. And now in our new studies, we reconstitute this in the other direction, so we ask what happens in professional mathematicians. Well, what we find is that when they do professional mathematics, they still use the same circuit. The circuit has progressively differentiated with education, and now it becomes able to do a sort of generalized concept of number. In the history of mathematics, we apply the term number now to things like complex numbers or real numbers, which are extremely abstract objects. Well, it all started from this foundation in evolution and this process of neuronal recycling, constructing more and more abstract objects out of this foundational system of number and space and time.
Yeah. So you have a study with an Amazon tribe.
Yes.
And I saw another study which is similar, also with another Amazon tribe. So both, I guess, has to do with this numericity in the brain without language itself, right? And I guess this is similar in monkeys. So it comes, as you say, and in babies, you can see. And the mechanism here, sometimes it's hard to talk about the mechanism itself. You have to look at the cells themselves, like firing, the neural code. But I guess it has to do with the way the brain itself is selecting information in a broad manner, like for little numbers and then high numbers. Is there some hierarchical process of numbers which is common to animals, to brains?
So let me clarify a little bit. Yeah. So the work that we did in the Amazon was asking a very specific question, and it's really a question of psychology. It was the question, can you have intuitions of numbers, including large numbers, when you don't have the words to speak about it? So it's not, of course, that these people don't have language. They have a very sophisticated language, but they have not invented counting. So these people have a system of numbers that stops at 5, and they never count. The system is not used for reciting. And so what we showed is that nevertheless, they have exactly the same intuitions of numbers as elsewhere in the world and as essentially young children who have not yet been educated. But that was pure psychology, so you're completely right. Through such studies we can show that there is a representation of number, but we cannot really tell how it's organized. Now the beauty of it is that the very same behavior, for instance the ability to decide which of two numbers is the larger, or to approximate a given number, or to approximate an addition, could be studied in non-human animals, including the macaque monkey. And this has been not my work, but the work of another researcher, Andreas Nieder. Well, I'm skipping one step. What we did in a human was to create a model, a hypothesis, a rather precise neural network hypothesis about how neurons could organize and have a collective code for number. And we made a very bold hypothesis actually at that time, which is that there should be cells that care about a specific number. So we would find, we predicted, a neuron that cares about the number 3. And it would fire when there are 3 objects. It would fire a bit less when there is 4, a bit less when there is 5. It would have a tuning curve for number. And for many years, actually, I went through different labs because at that time I was not doing any monkey research. And I said, well, you should study this in the monkey, you know. And I was trying to convince my colleagues, and everybody thought this was crazy. How could you study number in the monkey? And then one group did it. It was Earl Miller and Andreas Nieder at MIT. And they found the number neurons, as predicted. They had exactly the properties that we had predicted from the model. This was very pleasing from the point of view of a theorist. Also, the neurons were in the same location that we expected, in the prefrontal cortex and also in the intraparietal sulcus, exactly where in humans, with our imaging techniques, we found that humans do calculation. So essentially in the monkey, you go and record with an electrode, you find cells that fire, and in this case, they have a tuning curve. Each of them prefers a certain number. And some neurons prefer 1, some neurons prefer 2, some neurons prefer 3. And even the detailed profile of their responses could be explained by this mathematical model. So in this case, it's a good example, I think, of a case where we have a complete bridge from the single neuron to the population of neuron, to the circuit, and to the behavior that we see in humans, going through brain imaging as a way to see the whole circuit at the brain level in humans. And I think more and more we're going to see examples of this kind, where we have a bridge between fundamental neuroscience all the way to the behavior.
Nice.